Alright, so this Knife Thoughts video is going to be comparing and contrasting these two knives. This is the Spyderco Police 4 Lightweight, and this is the Cold Steel 4 Max Scout. And the reason I decided to do a video comparing and showing these two knives is because they're kind of similar in an interesting way. Both of these knives are budget or light, as in LITE, versions of two higher end models that each of these companies produce. So the Police 4 Lightweight is a lightweight version of the Spyderco Police 4 K390. And I actually realized, I didn't realize before doing a little bit of research for this video that, I guess maybe not research, but looking up information for this video, that they have actually discontinued the Police 4 K390. So I'm somewhat surprised by that. It was a knife that I'd read posts by Sal Glesser, the owner of Spyderco himself, saying that he really liked the knife, but that is something that I realized in looking up information for this video, whereas Cold Steel has not discontinued the regular or the higher end version of the 4 Max. So these are both light or budget versions of knives produced by the respective companies, but the Police 4 K390 G10 is going to be more difficult to find than the normal version of the 4 Max. So those two knives are higher end knives for each company. The Police 4 K390 was around $180 from dealers, and the 4 Max normal version was about $330, kind of varied somewhat, but around $330 for the normal version of the 4 Max. The Police 4 normal version had K390 steel, like I've been saying, which is a high-end carbon steel and G10 handles with full steel liners. So compared, this has nested steel liners, so not full, but still pretty full, and some holes drilled in it for helping to be lightweight. And instead of G10, it has FRN fiberglass reinforced nylon injection molded handles, and instead of the K390, it has VG10. Now I had the Police 4 K390, and it was a nice knife, but interestingly, I just couldn't keep it from getting pepper spots. And if you watch my videos, you know that I carry traditional knives pretty much every day, which have 1095, which is an even less alloyed steel than considerably less alloyed carbon steel than K390. And I don't have trouble keeping these from getting pepper spots generally, but for whatever reason I just could not keep the K390 from getting pepper spots. I even gave it a forced patina, pretty dark forced patina, and it still got pepper spots. It was almost like it was just getting it from being in my pocket. So very high wear resistance steel, but a steel that for whatever reason I couldn't keep from oxidizing. Now, I actually prefer the injection molded FRN handles on this. Now, a lot of people don't. A lot of people really like the feel of G10, and I understand that, but I really like how Spyderco does their FRN injection molded handles. And the reason for that is because when you get G10, unless it's really, really coarse G10, that handle, the tackiness, the grippiness of the handle is going to wear down over time just from putting it in and out of your pocket and using it, gripping it, and things like that. It will wear down. With this, let me see if it'll focus. With this injection molded plastic, you can see these bidirectional ridges are pretty raised. So those aren't going to wear down. You're going to have a good solid grip, that tackiness that your fingers, your hand catches, and it's not going to wear down enough that you lose that for a long, long time. So I really like that. It's lightweight, it's strong. I've done a lot of hard use with knives that had FRN handles, even without liners. and it's a very strong material. So I've never had any trouble with it, breaking or anything like that. But even without that, going along with the use of this knife that I'll talk about in a little bit, it's not going to matter too much. Now, VG10 definitely won't hold an edge as long as K390, but it's very easy to sharpen steel. It's kind of, I would say, very predictable for me to sharpen. I know how it's going to react because I've used it on Spyderco knives a lot. And it's a relatively stainless steel, holds an edge well, even though it's not a super steel. So I'm happy with the VG10. So I really like this knife as compared to the higher end version. Moving on to the Cold Steel Formax Scout, I have not had the higher end or the normal version of the Formax. Now, some differences with it is the normal version of the Formax has CPM 20 CV steel, which is a very good steel. It's a kind of a analog to M390. It also has G10 like the Spyderco higher end version, although it has sculpted G10, a little bit different than the Spyderco, and it has titanium liners. So the Formax Scout has, rather than G10 handles, it has what Cold Steel calls Griv-X. It's basically the same kind of material as the Spyderco. It's a fiberglass reinforced nylon as far as I can tell. It has a good amount of texture on it. It's not quite like the Spyderco. I don't know how well you can see that. I'm trying to get it to focus well there, but it's not like the Spyderco, where the Spyderco has these almost recesses. It's more raised bumps. You can see it better now, I think. So those bumps are raised up, and they're pretty small bumps, but it does give it good texture. I would say more similar to how G10 is than the Spyderco, but pretty good grip without it being, quite the same as the injection molded Spyderco handles. Instead of the CPM 20 CV steel, the Formax Scout has AUS 10A, which is, I would say, maybe more of a step down from the CPM 20 CV than VG10 is from the K390. Now, I'm not an expert on steel. I don't care about steel as much as some people, so in part because I am used to using 1095, which doesn't hold an edge. Well, it holds an edge well, but I mean, it's not a super steel. So I'm not an expert on steel, but the AUS 10A is, as far as I can tell, similar to the American 440 range of steels. So something like 440B, possibly 440C, something around that range. So it's definitely not a super steel, probably a step below VG10, but still a very good steel. My Pennsylvania accent makes it difficult to say steel and still back to back, but still a very good steel that's easy to sharpen and has, in my experience, held an edge relatively well. The liners on this are steel rather than titanium, which is an interesting choice. It's not really, honestly, a lightweight version of the normal Formax. It's actually, I believe, heavier than the normal version of the Formax, but more of a light as in less fancy, a budget version, something like that. So it does have full liners, and as you can see, there's really no cutouts or anything like that to help with taking the weight down. So this is a knife, designed to be beefy, which I'll talk about in a second. Now, it has been pointed out that the pivot seems to be smaller on the Formax Scout than on the normal Formax, and the stop pin seems to be slightly smaller. I don't think that really matters too much. That's not really where knives break, but just something to point out. Now, both these knives are, like I said, more budget-friendly versions. The normal prices for these knives are both about $115. So significantly less in the case of the 4MAX Scout than the about $330 more high-end version, the normal version. Not as much of a discount on the Police 4 Lightweight, being that the normal version was about $180, something like that, but still a pretty significant discount, so much so that it makes a pretty big difference, at least to me, in the value of the knife. So about $115 each, although I got each of these knives on discounts, just random discounts. I got this one at River's Edge Cutlery. Hope that the people cutting trees down and outside isn't too loud, but I got this in the background there. But I got this at River's Edge Cutlery for a discount, or discounted slightly, and I got this one from White Mountain Knives. Both discounted, not necessarily slightly, but enough that it made a difference to me, although I think that they're both still good values at $115 each. Now, they're both big knives. The Spyderco has a 4.39 inch blade, so almost 4.4 inch of blade, with about 4 inches of edge, 3.95 inches of edge. It has a 5.63 inch handle, and it is 0.118 inches thick on the blade. So it's a very long knife and a thin knife. The 4MAX Scout has a 4-inch blade, so a little shorter. It has about a 4-inch edge, and it has a 6-inch handle, so a bigger handle. And the big difference here is that it's 0.189 inches thick. So not quite, but almost twice as thick. Not fully twice as thick, but quite a bit thicker. They both have versions of the classic backlock. Now, they're both not exactly backlocks. When you think of a backlock, sometimes you think of it being down towards this end of the knife. Spyderco does what they call a mid-lock. This is a mid-lock because it's in the middle of the handle, which makes it able to be closed one-handed. And I really like Spyderco's mid-lock. They have done a lot over the years to improve the geometry of the lock so that their knives with mid-locks just lock up super, super solid. No blade play. I haven't had any forward to back blade play on this knife, as older or less improved, I guess, versions of the mid-lock sometimes do. So a super solid lock. Spyderco does a really good job of them. And the 4MAX Scout has kind of an updated or I guess made beefier or stronger version of the backlock or midlock, which they call the Triad Lock. It was actually designed by Andrew Demko, who is the designer of this knife. And the Triad Lock basically adds a stop pin to the backlock. So rather than like on a normal back or mid lock, the spine of the knife contacting the lock bar, on the Triad Lock it contacts that stop pin. So it should, might, and seems to make the lock a little bit stronger. I like the Triad Lock. I think Cold Steel has really dialed it in. I had some knives with the Triad Lock probably like 6 or 7 years ago, something like that, that were a little bit tougher to open and close, but this knife and other knives I've gotten recently from Cold Steel have just been super smooth, easy to open and close, and really well done. Another thing that this knife has that I really like and think other backlock knives should incorporate if they can is an over travel pin. So what that does, that pin that you can see in there, what that does is when the blade closed, this part of the blade contacts that pin, stopping it from continuing to travel. And why it might continue to travel is when you close this knife, it's closing from the spring pressure of that spring right there. That's how backlocks work. It's also very similar to how slip joints work. And when you close that, it can actually bounce. It can travel farther towards the back of the knife than it should, and that can make the edge hit against the spring or the locking area. And that stop pin stops that from happening because it's not going to bounce against the lock bar or the spring when it hits that fixed pin. I think that's a really good improvement. It's something that you don't see super often, but it's something that I think is worth putting in. Now, you don't really get, what can happen if you get that over travel is the edge hits the lock bar or the back spring and it will damage your edge. You don't really get that on Spyderco knives. I don't think that I've ever had that happen on a Spyderco knife, but it's something that's possible. It's also possible, less so, I think, from closing like that, and it more so possibly could happen from the blade being squeezed in towards the handle, which with the hump that is kind of necessitated by the spider hole is something that could happen. Now again, I haven't, that I recall, ever had blade wrap on a Spyderco, but it's something that you don't have to worry about at all when you have that over travel stop pin. And I appreciate that. On my traditionals, I really hate it when they have blade wrap because you have to sharpen it out and it lowers the usable life or shortens the usable life of the blade. And it's just frustrating. So I'm glad that this has that feature, although I don't see it as being an issue that this knife doesn't have that feature. So the locks are very similar. They're basically the same design, with this one having a little bit of updates, but this one having a lot of experience and history going into it because Spyderco has used the mid-lock a lot. So they're both really good locks, both really strong, and strong enough for sure on either of them for any normal daily use. When you use these knives, you're not going to break the lock if you use them with any kind of reasonableness or sense. And they're both really similar in length, as you heard from the specs. The edges are pretty much the same length, and the handles actually end up looking really, really similar in length. If you hold it up, for whatever reason, the specs of the cold steel are, a little bit longer, about a third of an inch longer, but you can't really tell too much. The handles are about the same length. They both have finger choils. As you can see, the Spyderco has the 50-50 finger choil, which is a nice addition. The cold steel has not really a 50-50 finger choil, but a very similar finger choil. And on a long knife like this, I think that that's a good addition. They both have really comfortable handles. The Spyderco, because it has this nice simple handle, is really, really comfortable. That's one of the biggest things actually that drew me to this knife, is the difference between this handle design and the Endura and Delica handle design. If you look at this knife, you might say, looks slightly different than the normal Endura. And that's because I actually sanded down this handle to make it more similar to this knife. I had this knife, I had heard about this knife coming out, and I was like, why not? I might as well do it because this knife hadn't come out yet. So I sanded these down because on the Endura and Delica, these two humps always kind of land right where my two fingers go, my middle finger and ring finger. You can see that when I grip this, that finger is landing right on that hump, and this one's right on that hump. So I never really felt that the Endura and Delica handles were perfect for my hand, and it was frustrating because I really like the design in general. So when I saw that Spyderco was making these have this really rounded, simple handle material, handle design, I was really excited for it, and it feels great. My index finger goes into this kind of cutout here, and then these two fingers just kind of sit there, and there's lots of extra space on there, even with my wide hands, because it is such a long handle. And I really like simple handles. I think simple handles make for ergonomic handles, and it's just a really, really great handle. I like the ergonomics of this knife a lot. So you can use it here with your thumb on the thumb ramp. I think it feels really good in that grip. If you need to, you can get lower and have a little bit more reach. And then you can also use it up here in the finger choil so that you can get a little closer to whatever you're cutting. And I'll even use it like this to get closer to the tip because it is such a long blade. So I really like the handle design of this knife. The handle design of this knife is more built for locking your hand in, I would say. What I mean by that is, whereas this knife is just kind of a straight handle so you can move your hand along it and things like that, it doesn't have the same upturn or guard that this knife has. So this is a more emphasized guard. Sometimes people point out this hole and wonder what it's for. This hole, originally Andrew Demko said that he was planning to make it so that you could put a pin through that and it would make it so the knife wouldn't close even if the lock did fail. He actually said in a video that I saw that it's not designed for that. It's more of an aesthetic thing, a design thing, but I think you could actually still do it if you found the right diameter pin and like a hair, whatever those things are called, to hold it in. So that's why that's there, but it has this really emphasized guard. So your finger is not going to slide forward as long as you're holding onto this knife, but you can move forward and grip up on that choil. And I think, again, it's a nice addition for this knife. It really, with this big blade, it's good to have that forward choil. But the other thing here is that it has this really sharp upturn towards the butt, and often I don't like knives that have that kind of upturn because it makes the main grip area shorter. An example of a knife that has that I don't like the ergonomics of is the Spyderco Paramilitary 2. But on this, because it is such a long handle and because it has kind of a gentle turn rather than like a really abrupt turn, it feels really good in the hand and it really locks your hand in. Like I said, I have wide hands and you can see that I have plenty of space there in the main grip area, and your hand's not going to slide either way. It does have some kind of finger cutouts or scallops. Those function in a really similar way. My index finger goes here, this finger goes here, this one sits kind of on this flat area, and then this one goes in the end. So again, I really like this handle design, but it's a little bit different intention behind the design. It's intended more to really lock your hand in. So that's kind of the start of the differences in these knives, and that's what I want to emphasize kind of as the point of this video, is that two knives that are similar in length and similar in the fact that they're designed to be budget versions of other models from the same company can have really different intended uses. So the Spyderco is a very thin knife. If you look at the profile, it's much thinner, maybe half as thick overall as the Cold Steel is overall. Like I mentioned earlier, the blade is much thinner and it has that long thin blade with a nice sweeping, not very abrupt, but sweeping design. And this knife is really designed to slice really well. It's a thin bladed knife, thin handle. You can carry this without it being very obtrusive in your pocket, and it's going to slice really, really well. I've used this to cut a lot of cardboard, and it just is like a laser through the cardboard. So this knife is designed to be a great slicer, but you could use it in, tactical type situations if you needed to. I don't carry knives generally as self-defense tools primarily. I carry them as utility tools and just because I like knives. But you could probably use it in that, although the tip is pretty thin actually. That tip is relatively thin, and if you use this knife for any kind of prying, which I wouldn't do, it might break off because that tip is relatively thin. So I wouldn't use this knife for what you might call hard use or abuse. I wouldn't pry things with it. I wouldn't really chop with it. On the other hand, that's kind of the intended use of this knife, I think. So it has that really strong overbuilt type lock of the Triad Lock. It has this just kind of ludicrously thick back strap and blade. It's almost 0.2 inches thick. Has a nice tall blade so that there's a lot of steel behind the edge. It's not as slender as the Spyderco's blade. It's a really sturdy blade because it has a lot of steel behind it. And it has that kind of more abrupt belly that gives it more of a sturdy tip. You can see how much thicker even at the tip the cold steel is. So this knife is designed to be a burly, strong knife. And now I'm not advocating for people to go out and do dumb things with their knives, for sure. You generally should just use a knife to cut things, right? That said, I have used this knife to pry. I was moving and needed to take a wheel off of a grill, and I used the spine, not the edge, the spine to, pry a piece off of it, and it worked really well. Didn't hurt the knife at all. Didn't create any blade play or anything like that. Worked, and no issues. I have also used this knife for chopping. I've used it to cut some small, not thick, very small, like no more than an inch briars and things like that I were kind of growing out onto our driveway. I've also used it to baton a little bit, very light batoning. I just basically needed a paint stirrer and didn't have one, so I just kind of tapped this through a piece of baseboard, and it worked fine for that. Split it really easily because of the thicker blade. Now, it took all of that with no issues whatsoever. I even chopped through a PVC sign that I needed to fit into the garbage can. Took all of that with really no issues. Some slight dulling of the edge when I did chop through those signs, but not enough that I needed a major sharpening. I've really only touched up the edge on both of these knives, which, being that they are lower end steels than the normal versions, is kind of impressive. I have used them both a good bit. On the other hand, this knife seems to slice relatively well. Now, it's definitely not as good slicing thick cardboard or, slicing against the grain of the corrugation of cardboard as this knife, because it just has a thicker blade. So it's going to, have more friction and be tougher to get through those more difficult slicing cuts. But it works well. I think you can use this knife for most EDC tasks as well as the heavier tasks. So I really do like both of these knives a lot. The one thing to be aware of with this knife is that, like a lot of cold steel knives, the clip is really tight when you get it. You might be able to see, if it'll focus well enough, there's some slight marks on the clip right there. That's actually from me trying to bend that tip up slightly to give a little bit more space between the handle and the clip, so that it's easier to get into the pocket. And I did that, didn't hurt the clip. It does make it easier to get in and out of the pocket. Another thing is that because this handle is pretty rough from that texture, the bumps, when you put it in and out of your pocket, it's abrading your pocket quite a bit. It's literally like a very low grit sandpaper. So I actually took some sandpaper and just kind of basically pulled it back and forth under that clip. It makes a really big difference, and that's something that I've had to do on other cold steel knives. So that's something to be aware of. It's an easy fix, to be honest. Just get some sandpaper and pull it back and forth under there, and it'll smooth it out. But that's one thing that I really like about, That's one thing that I really like about how Spyderco does their handles, is that you can see that they have this smooth or flattened area. And it's actually made so that it works on both sides of the handle and for any clip position. So you can see it's two-sided so that if you put the clip for tip down carry, it would still land on this flat area, and same for tip up. So you can see that this clip, where it contacts the handle, lands on this flattened area. Now, because this knife is so long, it doesn't land exactly in the area that it maybe should, and I think that they went with this being in the center of the handle. It still functions as it should without it necessarily being right in the center. I'll show you what it looks like on the Andorra. You can see that it lands a little bit more on that flattened area on the Andorra, but it works really well. It makes it so that it's really easy to get this knife in and out of your pocket, and that those injection molded gripping kind of texture doesn't tear up your pants pocket quite as much as the cold steel does before you modify it like I did. So that's, something that I like about the Spyderco. Isn't great about the cold steel, but it's an easy fix. So they're both knives that I really like. I'm happy to have gotten both of them and to use them. And I think it's just kind of interesting that two companies can take one of their models, their higher end models, and make budget versions of them and do them in such different ways. And really it fits the profiles of the two companies. Spyderco is known for making knives that are really good at cutting, really good at slicing, and that's really the case for this. It's a knife really well made to slice very well. And cold steel is known for kind of extreme, hard use type knives. So same deal here. This knife is made to be able to take a whole lot of abuse. And I think that they did a really good job on both of these knives for their intended uses, and it's a great way of showing how different the intended uses of knives can be. Just real quick to give you some comparisons with other knives to show you how big these knives are. This is a Spyderco Andorra, so you can see much smaller than both of these. Very similar design to the Spyderco. And then this is a Benchmade large Griptilian, so you can see that it's quite a bit shorter than both knives. And then finally, another really familiar, well-known knife. This is the Rat 1, so the larger Ontario Rat. And you can see how much smaller it is than both of these knives. So very big knives that have very different intended uses, but are both really well done, and I think really good values for what they offer at the price that they are at. So if you can find them, especially if you can find them with a discount like I did, I think that these are two knives that are worth checking out. I've been really enjoying them, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like the video, subscribe to my channel, and hit the bell for notifications. I really appreciate it. Also comment with any questions or comments you have. I enjoy reading those, whether they be support or questions or sometimes trolling. It's kind of funny to open up the YouTube app and see what people have to say. Also check me out pretty much on all social media at Knife Thoughts. And check out knifethoughts.com for articles on knives like this and other knife topics. And as always, don't forget to go out and do good.